This week's episode is sponsored by Godox.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And our audio engineer, Mike Weinstein, will no doubt pop in somewhere along the way with a question or two, and that's okay. He has our permission. Robert Frank is a legend in photo circles, and his groundbreaking book, The Americans, is widely viewed as one of the most important photography books of all time. The photographs in Frank's book, The Americans, were taken while traversing the country by car during a 1955 road trip funded by Guggenheim grant. That very same year, another photographer, Todd Webb, also received the Guggenheim that he used to fund a similar cross-country trip. Interestingly, they both received recommendations for their respective grants from none other than Walker Evans. A key difference in the approach to their journeys is that while Frank headed west in a used 1950 Ford Businessman's coupe, Webb's plan was to hoof it across the continent by donning a pair of surplus army boots and setting out by foot, bicycle, boat, and when crossing the open plains, nothing zippier than a Vespa. At age 49, Webb was 20 years Frank's senior, not to mention a more established artist when both men set out to document the country. Yet while Frank's pictures eventually earned him a cult status, Webb's photographs were all but lost to history until just a few years ago. A selection of photographs of mid-20th century America from the point of view of each of these unique artists is now featured in the exhibition and related catalog, America and Other Myths, which recently debuted at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. The show is notable on multiple counts. First, it presents an informed perspective on each man's photographic output and methodology. Second, it recontextualizes their travel experiences within a wider lens of mid-century American culture. And third, for revealing telling details about Frank's relative success amid Webb's conversely relative decline in obscurity, which by itself is a cautionary tale for any photographer seeking a place for their work. Joining us today to discuss both the photographs and the stories behind them are Lisa Volpe, photography curator at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and Bill Shapiro, former editor-in-chief of Life magazine and a writer who has examined this exhibition in depth for Blind magazine. Lisa Volpe and Bill Shapiro, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
And Bill, this is, I think, your third appearance on the show, which means that you're eligible for the free cap and T-shirt with the B&H Photography Podcast logo. Unfortunately, we never ordered any, so along with all of our other guests, you're going to have one of these days, but hang in there. And it's good to have you back again.
Thanks so much.
So anyway, and Lisa, welcome. Let's start off with a question for you, Lisa. How did the idea of this exhibition come about, and how long was it in development?
Well, I, like so many other people, all us photo nerds out there, I had no idea anyone but Robert Frank got a Guggenheim in 1955. And I really had never thought to look before. But in 2019, I was researching another exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe photographer, looking at all of the photographs that O'Keeffe took, photographs she took, not of her. I always feel the need to say that. And I learned that Todd Webb taught her to photograph. And so I went to the Todd Webb archive in Portland, Maine. I met the amazing Betsy Evans Hunt, who is executive director of the archive.
Yep.
She let me dig in. And Betsy so strategically on my last day there said, Todd got a Guggenheim in 55 also for a cross-country project. Would you like to see some of those images? And of course, my eyes lit up. I was really curious. This is Frank territory in my mind. Like, why had I never heard of this other photographer going cross-country?
Now, I have a question. Hold that thought. I have one question for you. When you started looking at the pictures, can you describe how far down your jaw dropped?
It was a half drop at that moment. Only because there are not a lot of vintage prints from this project of Webb's. And so there weren't a ton to show me. She hadn't dug out the negatives for me yet. But I knew I wanted to make a return trip to the archive to look at these 1955 negatives of Todd's and to really decide if there was a project there. And there was.
I know I can't speak for anybody else on the show, but I was introduced to Webb's work on a previous episode we did Todd Webb in Africa. And I was totally unfamiliar with his name, let alone his work. And I got a copy of the book and I was just totally floored. I just sat there and I went from one end to the other and then started it over again. His eye is phenomenal. And he's an amazing technician. And again, he's got an aesthetic that's very unique. And you look at his work and you say, how did this guy slip by? And then we'll get to the reason for that as well, which is also pretty bizarre. So both Frank and Webb made their respective road trips in 1955, the same year as the Family of Man exhibit debuted at the Museum of Modern Art. And both men were critical of this show, with Webb referring to it, and I'm quoting, a three-dimensional version of Life magazine, which is kind of an interesting take on it. Do you think either of them used their Guggenheim projects as personal vehicles for, say, repudiating what they felt was lacking or totally wrong with the MoMA's landmark exhibit?
Short answer is yes, absolutely. They were not fans of Family of Man, either of them. But as Webb's quote that you read points out, it's not just MoMA's exhibit, it's also Life magazine at the time. And I wonder if Bill wants to jump in and comment on that.
I do. And I've got my boxing gloves ready. But Lisa, I think I would take just maybe a little bit of a different point of view, deferring to you, because you're clearly the expert here. But I think both of these photographers were deeply curious, and they had their own vision and voice. And my sense was, again, not as informed as yours, that I don't think criticizing anything was their prime motivation for making the trip in the beginning. That said, my sense is that they both saw Luce's vision and Life's vision and version of America, as being rather limited and predictable. And those feelings would become much more pointed as they traveled and they saw rampant racism and over-the-top consumerism. But, Frank and Webb were artists. And that's not really what Life magazine was about. Life was a very, very mainstream magazine in many ways. And it was an editor's magazine, with the editors having more control than photographers in virtually every aspect. And I think for photographers who were not on staff, and even some like Gene Smith who were on staff, it could be a hard place to work.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that idea of editing was what they were struggling against. They wanted to be artists. They wanted their own vision to come forward. So, of course, Life wasn't the right fit for them. Family of Man was also a very edited exhibition. It was one person's perspective on all of these works. And so they struggled against that tenor of photography at that moment. Where was the voice of the photographer in all of this?
One thing that's interesting to me is that even though they were critical of the exhibit, I know Frank had work in the Family of Man. Did Todd Webb also?
Yes, he did. Yes.
That's what I thought. So even though they were critical of it, they still participated.
Well, I'm not even sure if they were asked to participate.
Oh, interesting.
I'm reading between the lines here. Todd Webb, I should mention, has a daily journal, which is just, a researcher's dream come true. So we get a sense of what he's thinking about at any moment. And there is an entry right before he goes to MoMA to see the show saying, people told me one of my photos is in the show.
Wow.
So it might not be clear to him, that it was being used.
It's kind of unique that you have this this journal to go by, because when we talk about photographers who are no longer with us and we start projecting all this stuff of what we think they were saying, it's all conjecture. Whereas you have something in your hand that's very tangible, and again, it's his voice, it's his wording, which adds a lot of credibility to it. And I think it's a pretty interesting tool to have when reviewing all of this.
Well, so I think it's worth mentioning that Todd Webb was not only a dedicated writer, daily, as Lisa just said, but also an excellent writer and a funny and insightful writer. And that journal is 3,000 pages. So, and all done on a manual typewriter, of course.
Wow.
And photo nerds will devour every single word. You get these insights to all the great names that you wish you would be able to speak to or know about. He's having lunch with Lisette Modell on Wednesdays. Bernice Abbott invites him over to the apartment to see these weird photos by some guy named Ajay. I mean, it's just the most incredible insight into photo history.
Have these writings been published?
A very abridged version was published in the late 70s. Todd did that himself.
Oh, wow.
But honestly, abridged, shibridged, you need the whole look at what was happening.
Right.
Actually, I curated a show of Todd Webb's work in, I think, 2016 at a gallery in Chelsea. And I thought that the journal was so well done that we blew up excerpts and put them next to various pictures that the moment sort of spoke to.
I want to follow up on the subject of Life magazine. When proposing his trip, Webb requested and received sponsorship from Life magazine, which paid for the film and processing and contact sheets in return for daily pictures showing Webb in the frame, which I think is kind of an interesting little deal that they made there. Bill, being that you're a former editor-in-chief of Life, do you know if these pictures were ever published in Life or anywhere, or are they contained in the magazine's archives? Because it's got to be a great, funny series.
Well, just so listeners don't think I'm 90 years old, this was 70 years before my time.
No, but what's time? It's all relative. Now, if you think about the Big Bang, what's 70 years?
It's true. But the answer to the question is no, the photos did not run. I'm not sure why, but I can speculate a little bit. Life was a weekly, and they routinely overassigned, way too much material so that they'd had stuff to pick and choose from. And a lot of great stuff ended up on the cutting room floor. Webb's negatives were returned to him. But I will say, and Lisa, please correct me if I'm wrong here, that Webb considered this Life assignment as something he sort of had to do for the money that paid for film and whatnot, rather than something that his heart was truly into. So while it's a very Life magazine story, man walks, boats, bikes across America, I personally have always found the shots that Webb took of himself on this trip to be slightly awkward. But I'd be so curious to hear what you think, Lisa.
Oh, I totally agree. He mentions in his journal that it's an awkward position to put himself in, but he needs not only the film, he needs someone to process the film and send him contact sheets along his journey so he can see what he's doing. There's really no other way for him to do that. And the deal with the devil, in some ways, is that he has to produce these really awkward selfies, as we call them now. And they're very strange. You can tell he wasn't comfortable. He didn't quite know what to do. And Webb was very clear within his own mind that the walking was not the point of the thing, but for Life it was.
How did Frank accomplish the processing, developing? Did he have benefactors, or did he have a better relationship with a studio?
He had various friends along the way that he would stop in and see and utilize their darkroom. We have a lot of great information from Wayne Miller, great Magnum photographer Wayne Miller, who watched Frank process a lot of the film that he took around the Los Angeles area. And it's actually from Wayne that we learned something so fascinating about Frank's editing process, which is he would hold up the newly processed strip of film and cut off whole portions of it to put in the trash.
That's so wild.
Ooh.
Wow. So he would make these split-second in-the-moment decisions, and those are done. That's gone.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Man. Now's the time for dumpster diving.
Yeah.
Seriously.
By the way, who owns the diaries that Webb produced? Does his estate own it? Or
they're at the archive, yes. At the Todd Webb Archive. Portland.
Gotcha.
One of the things that struck me also when learning that Webb chose to hoof it, more or less, brought me right back to a memory of another book that I had read a couple of years ago. It's called Bicycle Diaries by David Byrne of Talking Heads fame. He's a big biker, David. And wherever he goes, he has one of those folding bikes. When they're on tour, he has a bike with him and he travels as much as he can by bike. And he's also a photographer. And he specifically does this because you don't see the world through a car or a bus window. But when you're on a bike, or even better, walking, then you truly see what is happening where you are. And as I'm going over all these photographs and reading the story, I keep going back to Burns' book. That's exactly his whole point of view. You know, he takes the slow route, not the fast route. He wants to see what's there.
Yeah.
And that was obviously not Frank's modus operandi at all.
So Frank traveled by car and Webb traveled by foot and bicycle or boat and whatever was the slowest, the most convenient, or the best for that moment. Did their divergent modes of transportation affect the amount of time that each of the photographers spent visiting and photographing, say, larger cities versus the smaller towns and rural locations? Any idea about that?
I have a general sense of, and Bill can back me up on this, but I'm kind of a crazy researcher. I love uncovering every aspect of things. And so I do have a Google map that pinpoints their locations on each day. That I could kind of compare and contrast where they were going, both in their 55 and 56 trips. And, I would say just generally, and by nature of the trip they set out to undertake, Webb spent more time in rural locations, but that's because he was walking a straight east to west route. And there's not a ton, in the dead center of the country in terms of larger cities. Frank was driving, so he's on larger roads, highways, though the Highway Act won't be passed for another year. But he's hitting more major cities. But what is interesting about this, not necessarily where they go or how much time they spend, it's that neither photographer photographs any quintessential tourist locations. No kind of, you have to photograph the arch and see. No one's doing that. And neither of them produce any pure landscape photos.
Considering the fact that they were surrounded by landscape.
Yes.
I mean, you can't escape it.
Exactly. But they really rejected that idea. So I think that's the interesting thing that comes out in their travels, what they were not photographing.
I think there's something else that Lisa mentioned to me when we were talking for that Blind magazine story, is that Webb was very methodical, and he followed a carefully mapped out route following the path of pioneers from years and years before. So he knew exactly where he was going and exactly when he would arrive. And Frank, on the other hand, who subscribed to the, good things come from getting lost school of thought, more followed his gut with what Lisa has referred to as a restless energy. So really different kind of DNA for how they approach this.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you mentioned you made a Google map of both men's journey. Is that included in the exhibit?
It is not. In the end, we decided that geography wasn't important.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of the artists in their editing of their work ever sorted it by geography, really, or time. Webb thought about it a little bit more that way, but Frank was all over the map. I mean, if you think about flipping through the Americans, it doesn't follow any specific geographic logic.
Right.
And so it just fell farther and farther down the list of things that seemed to be important to them. And so in the end, we decided to cut that reference.
If I may ask a question, Lisa, did they ever get within like 500 miles of each other on the same day?
Good question.
Not on the same day. But in terms of where they photographed, yes. It makes it tricky because they both started their projects before they even knew they were receiving their Guggenheims. They were determined to do this work. They needed the money, certainly, but it was going to happen one way or another. And Webb had already left on his trip when he heard that there was a letter for him at home, and so he came back. and then left again a few days later after
with
accepting
a bigger
everything.
smile on his face.
Yes, exactly. And more confidence. And Frank also had already started the work. So the Cowboy at Madison Square Garden, the 4th of July in Jay, those were produced before he realized he had the Guggenheim. So just by nature of that strange timing where they didn't set off at the same time and actually kind of jumped the gun in both cases, they weren't ever overlapping on the same day.
So these two projects happened spontaneously and preemptively before they got this grant. What was it about America in 1955 that was so interesting or curious to these two people respectively? Did they have similar mission statements? Aside from what they wrote to Guggenheim, is there any other understandings about what they were looking for?
It's so tough to say. And I love this question because it's the question that I set out with. You know, I was curious, why did both of them design these projects at the same time? And honestly, I've never been able to come up with a completely solid, unbreakable answer. What we know from Webb's diaries is that he heard a radio program about a man who had walked across the country, and he really liked that idea. But why this year, why 1955 is unclear. We know that both of them didn't like Family of Man and that they didn't like, this ideology that life was peddling. So I can dance around it. I can give you all the context, but, who knows where that artistic inspiration actually comes from. And maybe that's okay that we don't know.
See, it could be as if Life magazine was presenting the Disneyland version and they wanted to go out and find the carny circuses that go town to town, in a sense, which honestly is more realistic to our world, okay, for lack of better ways of saying it. Something that I'm kind of curious about is that Frank reportedly took over 27,000 photographs over the course of his cross-country trip. Plus, he tossed away a lot more negatives before even making contact sheets. This is what we know of. And Webb, on the other hand, took about 10,000 images over the same course of time while walking, as opposed to driving and having all this mobility. Any thoughts in terms of quantity versus quality? When you look at the almost 3-to-1 advantage of Frank's output, does that throw any kind of shade over Webb's smaller trove of keepers? How does it all shake out? Because you guys have seen all, if not most of the pictures, whereas the general public, we've only seen what is selected for us to see. So
Right.
We can't weigh that out.
I would say it's not a quality issue. The quantity is more about personality, influencing approach, influencing style. Frank really believed that this mode of operating, driving in a car, taking a lot of quick shots from the hip at odd angles, was the style that could articulate America best. If you look at his previous work, it's very much like Webb. It's very composed, very still. It's that he switched styles to meet his subject. Webb, on the other hand, uses his style and uses it appropriately for his method of transportation. Walking is slower. He has time to think about, that sign that I can see a mile up the road. When is the perfect moment for me to photograph it? Is it here? Is it 20 yards ahead? Is it 30 yards? He has the time to think about all of that and figure it out. And for him, that was the point. He wanted to slow down and think about things differently. And so it's about that personality influencing the style, influencing their way of photographing. And so it's hard to say which one is better, but I love putting them together because it reflects two possible ways of doing the same thing, but also this turning point in the history of photographic styles. You really see how Webb's formal focus and his generation is kind of falling away in favor of Frank's more shot from the hip style.
It seems to be tracking with America. I mean, America at this time is super highwaying. It's becoming a nation of automobiles. It seems like Frank understood that he should join this project where Americans were at.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense. In their Guggenheims, Frank wrote, I want to, investigate America as it is right now and how that is influencing other countries into the future. So he's about the now and the future. Webb was interested in how the past had influenced the present.
If I could add one more thing, in Webb's career before this trip, he didn't have a lot of money. And so he would walk around New York, schlepping his tripod and his camera, and he might spend all day, Coney Island up to Harlem, and only make 5 pictures because he just didn't have the money to shoot. So he was very methodical and very careful. That was sort of his training. And I'm not totally surprised that carried with him on this trip as well.
I think another thing to keep in mind is that 1955 was unique in that the United States and much of the world was finally pulling out. First, we had in the 20s and 30s, we had an economic crash, the Depression, that led right into World War II. And the mid-50s was one of the first periods of time in decades where there was suddenly prosperity. People had money. People were buying their first homes. You had veterans coming back that had college educations that are going into new careers. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, the interstate highway system was a year away. It's not like we have all these interstates back then. That was first thought of back in the mid-50s. It was an Eisenhower deal where we're going to connect this country by highway. So the novelty of a car that people suddenly have, an automobile, which is a way of getting around and go to places where we couldn't go before because it was out of reach. And now we have the money to be able to do that. So in a sense, the automobile was like a new beginning for the United States, a new way of getting around, and obviously a novel way of seeing things, getting from point A to point B.
And also you mentioned Disneyland earlier. 1955 was when Disneyland opened, and also the same year that McDonald's launched its first stand. So it was
wow. Okay.
It was a moment in American consumerism.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. It was a different world back then. We take so much of this stuff for granted, but to go from New York to Philadelphia was a major trek. It wasn't just hop on 95.
Mm-hmm. So Robert Frank used a Leica for his Guggenheim pictures. Do we know what gear Webb used during his travels?
Yes, he carried 3 cameras. He carried 2 Leicas and a Rolly. Mm-hmm. So he wanted the flexibility of being able to shoot in different ways.
Do you know what he would be using the Rolleiflex for? Which obviously it's a larger format and a square aspect ratio. What did he primarily use the Rolly for as compared to the 35 millimeter Leicas with the 2:3 ratio?
It's a great question. I don't really have a sense of why he chose one over the other because I can think of examples, portraits using both,
Oh, okay.
Vernacular signs using both. So I'm not quite sure. I think he felt more comfortable with the 2.25 because, as Bill pointed out, he's a large format guy. He was used to lugging his equipment around New York. And he did call the 35 millimeter negatives postage stamps. He thought they were so small he couldn't quite understand how they were still getting this clarity. So it might have been more of a pacifier for him. I'm not quite sure.
Interesting.
One last gear question. What were the lens sizes that the 2 men used? Do we know that?
That I don't know. It's not written anywhere. And I'm a crazy researcher, and I tried to dig into the photos Webb took of himself to see the lens and the size, and I just never get quite good enough.
Well, if it was a twin lens reflex, it was most likely a 75 or an 80 millimeter normal lens, is my guess.
So I'm curious about Webb using the Leicas. Could it have been the first time he was shooting with a 35 millimeter, or did he shoot with Leicas earlier in his career?
He had practiced with them earlier. He knew he couldn't bring his 4x5 across the country with him. Yeah. And so again, he had been planning this trip for a while and was really dedicated to doing it. And so had taken all these practice trips walking to New Jersey or all around New York or even into Pennsylvania one day and shooting with the Leica just to get used to it.
Interesting.
One curious fact that stood out to me was the grant submissions. They both requested the same exact dollar amount. Is that just pure coincidental historical stuff, or is there some significance there? Were they coached that $3,600 was a sweet spot? I know that they both had a relationship with Walker Evans.
Yeah, I think it was the sweet spot at that moment. I found it too coincidental that they both asked for the exact same amount of money. And of course, Walker basically ghost wrote, if that is a term we can use, Frank's application for him. That's something that's well documented, very clear. But Walker didn't know that Todd was applying for the Guggenheim until he had already basically turned in his application. And then Walker said, "Oh no, let me write you a recommendation," not revealing that he was also on the selection committee. So, they both had the inside track on this one. Frank, was basically a shoo-in, and Webb, with that extra boost then was also pretty guaranteed.
Wow. So not only did he write recommendations, he was also on the selection committee?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
These things don't happen today. And actually,
right, exactly.
I will say that the Guggenheim Foundation today still holds their cards very close to the chest. Even when requesting these records from 1955, they want to know exactly what I need to know and why I want to know it and everything.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what about the fact that they both reapplied and got a grant the second year? I never was aware that was possible. Currently, is that possible, or was it just because it was a smaller pool back then?
I think you are right that it was because it was a smaller pool. It was a renewal grant. And again, I reached out to the Guggenheim and said, what's up with this? And the answer they gave me was that was something that we did early on. It was eliminated pretty quickly with the foundation. And now artists, if they get the grant once, are no longer eligible.
I would imagine it was strictly artists who had to know about it. There was no internet. There was no, mass announcements from PR firms. It wasn't pushed the way it is today. So the only people who I would imagine were applying were serious artists who knew about these things because it was a small click. I mean, today, you make an announcement, the whole world knows about it before lunchtime.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I would imagine they heard about it from each other. One of the things I've realized from Webb's daily journal is how related everyone was, how, much in each other's business they were. So I think once somebody found out about this and got one, then the rest of the crew was interested. But you're right, it didn't spread like it would today.
Okay, we are going to take a short break, and when we return, more about the iconic imagery of Robert Frank and Todd Webb with Lisa Volpe and Bill Shapiro. Stay tuned.
Ultra compact at 18 inches long and weighing in at only 1.2 pounds, the Godox LC500 and LC500R mini LED light sticks provide a portable, handheld lighting option as a hair light, side light, or fill light. While both light sticks provide adjustable daylight to tungsten color temperatures, the LC500R Mini also has a full RGB mode, so you can choose from the entire color spectrum for your scene. Each mini light stick features multiple lighting effects, a set of barn doors, a long-lasting rechargeable battery, and Bluetooth remote control from your smartphone. The lighting possibilities with the LC500 and LC500R mini LED light sticks are endless. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about the Godox LC500 and LC500R mini LED light sticks, or use the link in our podcast show notes.
Okay, we are back, and we are discussing the photographic work of Robert Frank and Todd Webb. And we're speaking with Lisa Volpe and Bill Shapiro, experts on the topic at hand. And now for Lisa, let me give a question to you for starters here. Now, both of these artists photograph similar subjects, but with very different artistic visions and styles. Webb being more classical and composed, and Frank more spontaneous and edgy. Can you talk about how comparisons and contrasts between their pictures were handled in the exhibition design?
Yes, it's a key element to what we're doing in the exhibition and also in the catalog. So as you walk through the exhibition, you'll see photographs side by side, one by Webb, one by Frank, similar subject matter. And just having them next to each other makes you do that natural thing we do, is compare them and see what's different about them and really kind of parse out the different ways of seeing for both of them. And then on the wall next, we'll have a run of one of the photographers, so several Franks in a row, so that you can understand perhaps what Frank was interested in or looking at that Webb didn't look at.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come back together with another comparison. And it all kicks off with their two different visions of the road, because what better way to start, and Webb's is, of course, horizontal, as any classical landscape is, with the sky taking up 1/3 and the land 2/3, all perfectly precise. And this beautiful ribbon of silvery road running off into the distance with one car almost at dead center.
And if I'm not mistaken, and the sun is behind it, so it's all backlit, and you get that glistening and the long shadows.
Yes.
It's very interesting stuff.
It's gorgeous. And then in comparison, you have Frank's, which is vertical and, a little bit grainy, and the camera's tilted down a little bit more into the road, and you're right in the center of the road. And you see that center line just kind of rocketing up to the top of the image frame, and you can feel the speed. So they're just such wonderful ways to kick it off and really demonstrate the differences in approach.
I'm just curious about one thing. I'm listening to you talking and describing the angles and everything else. Did Webb work on a tripod and while Frank was handheld? Do you know if there's any that in play? Because that goes side by side with what you were just describing to me.
No tripod.
No tripods. It's just that that's the way they were. Okay.
Yeah, he considered bringing one, but in the end thought it would be too bulky. So... and, with the similar subjects, I should add, one of my goals for this exhibition was not only to allow people to discover Webb, but to rediscover Robert Frank. Because so much of what we've been told about Frank and the Americans specifically is wrong. That the work is unique because of the subject matter he chose. Cowboys and trolleys and all these things everyone had ignored. Well, that's not true. And I'll show you, because I'll put it right next to Webb photos of the same things. So, I hope that by correcting some of these assumptions, we're going to dig down into what really makes Frank special.
So Frank was born and raised in Switzerland, while Webb was born and raised in Detroit. How do you think their backgrounds and native lands influenced their respective visions?
I think their upbringing had a lot to do with it. Webb didn't come to photography until he was about 30 years old, where Frank was born into it. His father was an amateur photographer. Their neighbor worked in a photo studio and taught him a lot of basics early on. So in some ways, Frank learned to see the world through photography, where Webb saw the world and then wanted to capture it in a photo.
For me, and as usual, I would defer to you, but, Webb struck me as very much of an insider with respect to America. Like his family had been here for years and years, and he'd sort of gone from one job to another, and things had always sort of turned out okay. So did he have faith in America? I think so. Frank, on the other hand, was, as we all know, more of an outsider, Swiss Jewish, had an accent, didn't look like he came from pilgrim stock. And in fact, he was arrested in the South, essentially for kind of looking different. So for me, that his take would be more other and more maybe circumspect makes sense. And so I do think that it influenced their visions, but also maybe, their methods, where Webb felt he could linger for longer, but Frank, who looked other, moved in quickly, moved out quickly, sometimes not even raising his camera to his eye before he was out the door.
Which also might explain why he drove a car, not a Vespa.
Really?
Seriously.
Exactly.
Absolutely. But yeah. And I think that's what, I'm trying to get at also, that their personalities influence their method of travel, influence their style, and that you can't uncouple those things in any way.
Webb crossed the country wearing his house slippers, whereas Frank had his jogging shoes on. That's really what the difference is, because they're different natures, their backgrounds, and what their, what life has taught them so far. Don't get too comfortable.
Right. I will caution, though, because again, the myths surrounding the Americans are so intense. And, so many people think this is Frank's first time in America, and it is not. He had been in America since the late 40s, had left for a little bit, but came back and was a naturalized citizen by now. So in some ways, he's an American. Yes, he has an outsider perspective, but this isn't his first time seeing America. Seeing it at this scale, yes, but he's been around.
So, Lisa, you write in the catalog essay that sequencing was an important aspect of Webb's work. Was there much evidence of sequenced images in the Guggenheim project?
Yes and no. There were moments that he really was interested in producing something sequential. He went to a steel mill in Pittsburgh and was really interested in the start to finish aspect of that. But again, that kind of links us to Frank and how he went to the Ford plant in Michigan and was interested in the sequence of producing a car. So both men were really interested in multiple photos being able to tell the whole truth of a story, rather than a single photo. And I think that just brings us back to, their problems with Life magazine and with Family of Man, that this reduced scale of a photographer's output and then being edited so heavily through someone's perspective. That's what they were against. But they both produced sequential views during their trip, if the situation called for it.
So, Lisa, I understand that Webb lost possession of these photographs due to an unscrupulous, would that be a buyer or a
dealer?
Yeah. But regardless of that loss, do we understand or know if he had aspirations to produce a work based on what he had done with this grant?
Absolutely. In their Guggenheim applications, they both note their desire to publish. Now, Frank already has a deal with Del Pierre. Basically, as soon as the work is ready, it's going to be published. Webb does not have a deal in place. And so when he returns after his 56 trip, he starts looking for publishers. And just one thing happens after another that kind of, puts it on hold, or people are taking too long to decide, or people are offended by this or that. And eventually he just says, okay, he's a gentle guy, and so says, it's fine, it's not going to happen. I'll just put it aside for a while and move on to the next thing.
What I think is interesting is that, despite the volume of iconic imagery that each of these photographers produced over the course of their Guggenheim travels, the public response was essentially meh. It kind of went over to deaf ears. And even Frank's book, The Americans, was initially a very tough sell. Was this a cultural flavor of the month moment?
I would love to hear everyone's opinions about this, but it wasn't as hated as we love to make it out to be, The Americans. And the June Leaf and Robert Frank Foundation let me go through Robert's archives, and I found a small clipping from the Durham Morning Herald. And you can all see this because Bill put it in the Blind Magazine article. And it's notable because, first of all, it's Durham, North Carolina. How the heck did Robert Frank get his hands on a clipping from a Durham, North Carolina newspaper? But the fact that he kept it for decades and decades and decades should also tell us something. And what's notable about it is it's one of the only articles that I think got it right, that really understood what he was trying to do with the Americans. And so he kept it. And it said, the pictures are sad, but also heartening and glad. And I think people weren't necessarily ready to see that Frank was critiquing things, but he was critiquing them from a place of love and from a place of wanting things to get better and to improve. And a lot of people just stopped at the pure critique and thought that's what it was. And Webb's could fall into that same category because they were both critical of the exact same things, racism and all this consumption that kind of drove people's lives. And I don't know if there was an audience for that at the moment.
So being the audio guy who is just now getting into photography, I don't know too much about some of the stuff, like the book itself, The Americans. It's widely regarded, so I hear, as one of the most popular photo books ever produced. But this was a sleeper kind of thing. It attained cult status. It didn't achieve popularity right at its inception.
No, and you can understand why from everything we've talked about, that his style for the time was very radical. Webb's style was more in the pocket of the moment. And Frank, the style he chose for the Americans was everything but, sometimes out of focus, sometimes playing with the contrasts, sometimes overexposed. And that he didn't mind. He said the world moves quickly and not necessarily in perfect images.
When did The Americans finally become established as one of the great works in mid-century American photography?
It took a few years.
So do you think it was significant that Frank was more and more connected to the Beat generation?
It sounds like that Frank is so intuitive. He's ahead of the Beat generation.
Well, and it's worth mentioning, Jack Kerouac wrote the introduction to the American version of The Americans.
Yeah, he was connected with the Beats well before he went on the trip, the Guggenheim trip.
But it sounds like the Beat generation itself is the catalyst for the ascendancy of the book.
Yeah, I would say time, maybe too. I keep coming back time and time again to that age difference between the two photographers, 49 versus 29. I mean, how many 29-year-old photographers do you have on this podcast, right? They have to reach a certain level before we start really paying attention to what they're doing in order to respecting it in some ways. That's just a generational thing. That's how the world works. And so, he needed to grow a little bit and do a little bit more before people kind of took it seriously.
Interesting. So let's go back to the story about Webb selling his archive to these gallerists.
If I may butt in for a second, if you're new to the business, take out a pencil and paper right now and take notes. Okay? You're about to get a business lesson. All right?
Yes.
Lisa, give us the story here.
Well, it's an incredible story. In 1976, there was kind of a loose collective of some dealers, 3 of them, that approached Todd Webb and offered to buy his entire archive, prints, the journal, negatives, everything, for $60,000. And Webb, who, I think we pointed out earlier, who would use like one piece of film sometimes a day and would write in his journal that he hopes he never makes more than $15,000 a year. All he needs is food and photography. $60,000 was so much to him. This is just too good to be true. And so the dealers took possession of all of Webb's material, multiple steamer trunks full of material, and paid him $10,000 and never sent another check. So because they had never paid for the material, legally they didn't own it, so they couldn't do anything with it. So they just kind of hid it away. And it jumped owners. We're not quite sure, maybe one or two times. And Betsy Evans Hunt, the executive director of the Todd Webb Archives, started seeing things pop up on eBay and tracked it down to some guys in Oakland and found all the trunks just sitting there. And so inside was Webb's life work, really. Now, the year is notable, 1976, because this is the year that photo as a field is really taking off. We have museum departments, many of them being formed in 1976, academic departments for photography being formed in 1976. My own department was formed in 1976. This is the year that we're making photography official. So the fact that he's absent means a lot. And it's also notable because Frank made a bad deal with these same guys also in 1976.
Wow.
Were they actively going out trying to take advantage of the lousy business sense of artists?
Yes.
Is that what was that driving
Just
this?
hiding it away in the basement for no one to see.
I didn't say that, but I'm not mad that you said it. So.
Well, that's the curious thing is that so they pay him $10,000.
Yeah.
Do we know what the arrangement was for the additional payments for this?
I don't exactly. Betsy would be able to tell you, but we just know that they never sent another check.
And is there any idea or any clue as to, okay, they forked over a sizable amount of money for a whole bunch of art and then did nothing with it, basically shielded it from the world, buried it. It's terrible, but it also is confusing.
Well, not necessarily, because if again, depending on the age of the artist and the age of the people who are buying it, if they think they're going to outlive this person and take advantage of the fact that he's naive about the value of what he has, it might be worth it to sit on it for a decade or two, and then when this artist passes away and they got all this stuff, then you can cash in without any kind of problem.
Is there any evidence of any other photographers that this happened to at that time?
Yes, Walker Evans.
Really? Oh, boy.
Same group of guys.
Wow.
And those are the three I know about because my research had been centered on this project, and that's how I uncovered it. But who knows how many other photographers fell victim to this. Now, the Walker Evans story ends up on a much happier note. As we know, the archive eventually makes its way to the Met. However, Walker was never happy about it, and many people think the sale of his archive was what caused him to drink himself to death.
Ooh.
And then Frank so the sale for Frank was whatever was left in his darkroom from the Americans, which, as the photographers out there will know, those aren't your greatest prints. Those are like, oh, that print isn't great, I'll just set it aside. This one is a little too dark, whatever.
Those are the ones you ate lunch over.
Right, exactly. Coffee stains on them and all sorts of things. They bought everything that was left in his darkroom and also somehow snuck in the copyright for the Americans.
Jesus.
Ooh.
And when Frank found out that the copyright was part of that deal, that's when he started fighting back. And he made art about this situation and how angry he was about it.
Huh.
And Peter McGill, his longtime friend and dealer, told me that you can tell which Frank prints were, pre-bad deal and which ones were post-bad deal, because the bad deal ones, the ones that came out of his darkroom that he was forced to sign so they could go on the market, are signed in a different way. So Frank was leaving us a code behind so that we would know. But it's just such a fascinating story, and someone needs to dig into it a little more.
We have to find the gallerists and publish their addresses.
Did he ever get the copyright back?
Yes, it took about 10 years, but he did.
Oh, that's amazing. I had a copy of the first edition of The Americans. It was gifted to me, and I in turn gifted it to somebody else. Actually, John Harris, my former co-host here on the show. I gifted him that about a few years ago for Christmas.
Oh my gosh!
Oh.
Yeah, I owned it for a long time, and I knew he had a more recent copy, and I knew that it would blow him away. And it's like I was in the midst of moving. I've looked at this thing enough times. I've had the pleasure of it. Now someone else will. So, and someday he'll gift it to somebody else someday.
Well, instead of my hat and T-shirt that may never.
Yeah, really.
I just want to say one quick thing to put the $60,000 that Todd Webb was offered or contracted into context. That was about $325,000 in today's value.
Yes. Important to say.
Just to sort of put that in context.
So, Bill, you actually wrote another story for Blind called You're Wrong About Robert Frank, where you talk about the fact that he was so often characterized as being mean and surly, but he was actually very gentle and giving and warm, and that there was a story from a close friend of Frank's, Clark Winter, who we just mentioned, and you end the passage saying that rather than being reclusive, he was actually just being protective. And I would extend that to say protective about his work. So do you think that protectiveness influenced the uniqueness of his vision?
I do. Robert Frank shot what Robert Frank wanted to shoot. He followed his vision, and to my knowledge, didn't allow himself to be influenced by trending commercial factors or outside pressure. In the video of never before seen footage that we released on Blind Magazine and that Clark Winter, his friend, made decades ago, Frank even says that he didn't want to be pressured to keep making pictures of boys with tubas, which is a reference to a popular image in The Americans. So he was very out front about that. And he was, in his blood, an artist. And he followed that feeling. He didn't want to be bothered by mundane, quotidian distractions at the expense of making art. And for me, one of the great examples of that, tangible examples, is his desk chair, which Clark has and which I had the honor of sitting in. It is ripped down the middle. The seam is split. It's totally falling apart. And it was like that when Frank was using it because that stuff didn't matter to him. And, he didn't want to waste time searching for a new chair when he could be making art. And I think that self-protection helped keep his vision pure.
I would just add that one of the other amazing tidbits that will get your mind spinning that we learned from Clark is that Robert Frank, who we all think of as being surly or curmudgeonly, collected heart-shaped rocks in Nova Scotia. So there is a softer side there that we need to start, acknowledging.
And also, Clark's wife was sick and was diagnosed with something serious. And Clark told me that Robert called her and checked on her every single day for months, which is not the kind of behavior you think about when you think of somebody who is surly and mean and curmudgeonly.
Clark was a neighbor in Nova Scotia,
No,
correct?
he befriended Robert early on and went to visit Frank and June Leaf many times there and brought his very large, very old movie camera with him.
We've had a couple of these interesting stories in popular culture with Vivian Mayer, but we also had Charles Daniels, who we interviewed a couple of months ago on the podcast. But Lisa, when you found out from the estate of Webb that this trove, this cache existed, what did it feel like for you? Was that just a mind-blowing kind of thing?
I didn't learn about the Webb cache, the hidden trunks, at the time of their discovery.
I did.
Bill, anybody chime in here.
Bill?
Well, we had a whole episode on that. And yes, that was the reaction. Oh, my God. And there's another trunk and another trunk. Mm-hmm. So, talk about dropping jaws. That was a real jaw dropper right there.
Betsy was super strategic about how she approached these collectors. And
she knew what she was dealing with.
She knew what she was dealing with. And, I sort of compare her to like an expert fisher person, who kind of reeled them in slowly, showed that she was interested, didn't show all her cards, just to mix metaphors completely. And, in the end, she walked away with all of it. And I remember her calling me, and this was not that long after the exhibit that I curated of Todd's work. And she couldn't believe it. She was like, don't tell anyone, but, you're not going to believe this. So she was over the moon.
Right. I'm just so curious about this. First of all, who is she? Is she related to?
She was friends with Todd. They were all friends.
Yeah, what happened was Betsy had a gallery.
That's right.
She had a gallery in Portland, Maine, after a long career in the photo world in New York, and she would put on shows and whatnot. And one day, this elderly couple walk in, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we used to chat with that photographer, and we knew that guy." And they started a relationship. And Todd and his wife Lucille didn't have children, and they sort of adopted Betsy as their daughter. And their relationship was very close for years. And they left their estate to her.
Right.
It's an amazing story.
It's beautiful.
The whole thing is an amazing story.
Yeah.
Really, really something.
So they left her estate, but that is Sands Trove, right?
Correct.
And so then she embarks on this mission to recover this stuff. And did that take a number of years?
I'm quite terrible with time. If I had to guess, I would say about 18 months, but don't hold me to that.
Right. Interesting. I'm wondering, from just looking at the work and looking back at this time period and their efforts, beyond the aesthetic differences and beyond the style differences, do we see an apprehension of America difference? Like, do we see a sunnier, rosier look from one or another? Do we see a more pessimistic look? Do we see more of an indictment by one, more of an endorsement by the other? Yeah.
Right. I mean, I guess I would say that they both were critical of what they saw. And my understanding from Lisa's scholarship, and I cannot recommend the catalog that she put together and wrote highly enough. It's extraordinarily enlightening and very approachable and readable. But how I've made sense of what I've read of her work is that they both became more critical along the road as they were seeing rampant keeping up with the Joneses consumerism, as they were exposed to racism in a way they maybe hadn't seen before. But, and I can't say that, one was more critical in his heart than another, but I will say that their critiques took different forms and took the voices that they were used to speaking in. Frank's was a little bit more in your face, and Webb's critiques could be a little more gentle and sort of nudging and ironic rather than as biting as Frank's. But Lisa, I'd love to know what you would either add on to that or not.
I'm still over here blushing about your compliments on the catalogs. No, I wouldn't add anything to that. I think that they both saw the same social ills playing out in American culture. They just talked about them differently. And I think that's important to know because, again, this idea of discovery and rediscovery, we think Frank was the ultimate critic, but Webb had the same critiques. So if we step back now, how do we really view that moment? And I've had people ask me, what do you think has changed from then to now? And I say, different clothes, different car. But everything else kind of remains with us in one way or another. And so it's important to revisit.
Yeah.
So the exhibit recently opened at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and it's also going to travel to 2 other venues. What are those venues and dates, Lisa?
And please make one of them Boston or New York, please.
the Addison Museum in February 2023. And then Brandywine, that's kind of close, to New York, in February of 2024. We're really excited to have it traveling. And I will also say that in Brandywine, just knowing the wealth of material there is to choose from, they might have a tiny bit of a different selection of Todd Webb material because he came through town or very close to them. So they have chosen some photos from their area of the world.
Wow. Okay. I definitely would love to see this show. Absolutely. It's I'm a big fan of both of their work. And I have to say that if I had to choose one over the other, I mean, Robert Frank is amazing, okay? But honestly, Todd Webb, he just bowls me over. I mean, between the work he did on this particular project and the work he did in Africa, which is totally different, and for a commercial bent, no less, I just find him to be just totally fascinating as aesthetically, technically, and everything else about that. It's been a great show. It's been a lot of fun talking with you guys today. Lisa, do you have anything else coming up in the near future?
Not near future. In a museum world, my closest exhibition now is coming up in 2027.
That's what I should say. Do you have anything else coming up in the common era?
Yeah. No. But 2027, we are partnering with several other major museums across the country to take a look at photo magazines, as I'll be calling on Bill again. But these are kind of competitors to Life magazine aimed at the Black middle class. So starting from the 20s and ending with Ebony.
Okay.
Who were the photographers? What were the photo essays?
That sounds great.
How were they articulating a Black middle class lifestyle?
Oh, I love that.
Wow.
So cool.
Researching this one's going to be fascinating.
Yes.
You're going to run into all kinds of stories and situations, no doubt.
Yes, and so many names I've never heard
Right.
of with amazing photographs.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Wow, what a wonderful idea.
Stay tuned.
Will do. Bill, what about yourself? You working on any other projects now or coming up soon?
Well, I should say that I haven't even thought about 2027. I'm working on a much tighter time frame. I'm working on an incredible photo story now that will actually be appearing next year in Texas Monthly. It's an in-depth look at homicide and everyone that it affects by the great photographer Richard Sherham, whose work I just think is wonderful. And I'm also working on what I think is going to just be a brilliant book by Greg Gulbranson about a gang leader in the Bronx and the role that guns play in the cycle of violence there. And Gulbranson is actually a pediatrician, but he spent 3 years on this story. And the pictures are like intimate and chilling and incredible. And it feels like a Life magazine story. And it's going to be published by Gost Books.
Wow.
That sounds cool.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
That sounds
Is that
interesting.
present day Bronx?
He's been shooting for about the last 3 years. Yeah. And then on a totally different note, I write about cannabis culture for Esquire, so I always have new stories there.
I bet.
Yes, it's a growing world out there. Absolutely.
No pun intended.
That's great. It's been wonderful speaking with both of you, and the subject matter is fascinating, and you guys brought a whole new life to it. So we thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and experience about Robert Frank, Todd Webb, and the amazing work that they do. So thank you both again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Anytime. And again, promise one of these days we'll catch up with the hats and T-shirts, okay? Right after lunch, we're going to get on it. I promise you.
Great.
Now, if you are a fan of the show, but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Alan Weitz. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Our executive producer is Grant Willig, and our editorial director is Sean Steiner. On behalf of everybody I just mentioned, thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Godox for sponsoring this week's episode.